Hey guys, I'm going to read to you chapter 7 through 12 today of Peter Brown's The Wild Robot. Um, Last week I posted a video of chapters 1 through 6. You can find that video here in my YouTube channel and listen to that. So what happened last time, just as a quick recap, um, this robot Roz that you see up here, she actually got washed up on shore with a bunch of other robots, but their robots were all broken. And she's a robot that can help people and help them do things. And so that is her whole purpose. And so now she's on shore. She's very curious about everything. She met some sea otters. They were terrified of her. They played with the dead robot parts that were on the beach when they washed up on shore. She has now climbed up into a forest and is starting her adventure there. So this is chapter 7, The Wilderness. Animal sounds filled the forest, chirps and bats, wing beats, and rustling in the underbrush. And then from the sea cliffs there came new sounds, heavy crunching footsteps. The forest animals fell silent, and from their hiding places they watched as the sparkling monster stomped past. But the forest was not a comfortable place for Roz. Jagged rocks and fallen trees and tangled underbrush made it difficult for her to walk. She stumbled along, struggling to keep her balance, until her foot snagged and she toppled over like a piece of timber. It wasn't a bad fall, no dings, no dents, just dirt. But Roz was programmed to keep herself in good working order, and once she was back on her feet, she immediately began cleaning herself off. Her hands darted around her body, quickly brushing and picking off every speck of dirt. There's a picture of Roz in the forest. Only when the robot was sparkling again did she continue through the forest. Roz stumbled on until she found a patch of ground that was flat and open and carpeted with pine needles. It seemed like a safe place, and safety was all the robot really wanted. So she stood there, motionless, all perfect lines and angles set against the irregular shape of the wilderness, meaning that Roz did not blend in with the wilderness. Um, but that's where she was standing. Chapter 8, The Pine Cones. If you stand in a forest long enough, eventually something will fall on you. And Roz had been standing in the forest long enough. A gentle wind whispered through the treetops, and then thunk! A pine cone bounced off her head. The robot looked down and watched the pine cone roll to a stop. It seemed harmless, so Roz went right back to doing nothing. A few hours later, a gust of wind rushed through the treetops, and then thunk! The robot looked down as another pine cone rolled away. And then a few hours after that, a howling wind tore through the treetops. It bent trunks and shook branches, and then thunk, thunk, thunk. Pine cones began raining down. Thunk, thunk. Roz felt something like annoyance. Thunk. She quickly scanned the area for somewhere safe from pine cones, and then she spotted the perfect place when she looked up at a huge rocky shape that towered above the forest. Chapter 9, The Mountain. Roz was now stomping her way up the mountain. Dense forest and rocky outcrops forced the robot to zig and zag and backtrack. But after an hour of steady hiking, she arrived at the craggy mountain peak. Grasses and flowers and shrubs sprouted from every pocket of soil, but there was no trees at the top. Roz was safe from those annoying pine cones. She dusted herself off and then carefully climbed up a leaning slab of stone to the very highest point of the entire mountain. The robot slowly turned her head completely around. She saw the ocean stretching to the horizon in every direction, and in that moment, Roz learned what you and I have known since the beginning of the story. In that moment, Roz finally realized that she was on an island. Roz looked down and surveyed the island. Starting from the sandy southern point, the island grew wider and greener and hillier until it finally jutted up into the rocky cone of a mountain. In some places, the mountain fell away, leaving sheer cliffs. A waterfall rushed off one cliff and fed a river that wound its way through a great meadow in the center of the island. The river flowed past wildflowers and ponds and boulders and then disappeared into the forest. Blurry shapes suddenly cut through the robot's vision. She focused her eyes and saw vultures circling above the foothills. Then she noticed lizards warming themselves on a distant rock. A badger peeked out from a berry bush. A moose waded through a stream. A flock of sparrows turned in perfect unison above the trees. The island was teeming with life, and now it had a new kind of life, a strange kind of life, artificial life. So there's the landscape of Roz on the mountain, looking at everything from the island's view. Chapter 10. The Reminder. I should remind you, reader, that Roz had no idea how she had come to be on that island. She didn't know that she had been built in a factory and then stored in a warehouse before crossing the ocean on a cargo ship. She didn't know that a hurricane had sunk the ship and left her crate floating on the waves for days until it finally washed ashore. She didn't know she had been accidentally activated by those curious sea otters. As the robot looked out at the island, it never even occurred to her that she might not belong there. As far as Roz knew, she was home. Chapter 11. The Robot Sleeps. Roz stood on a peak and watched the sun sink behind the ocean. She watched shadows slowly spread over the island and up the mountainside. She watched the stars come out, one by one, until the sky was filled with a million points of light. It was the first night of the robot's life. She activated her headlights, and suddenly bright shafts of light were beaming out from her eyes and illuminating the whole mountain top. Too bright, so she dimmed them. Then she turned them off and sat in the darkness and listened to the chorus of nighttime chirps. After a while, our robot's computer brain decided it was a good time to conserve energy. So she sat and anchored her hands on to the rocks, her non-essential programs switched off, and then, in her own way, the robot slept. That was chapter 11. The robot sleeps. Chapter 12. The storm. This can't be good because I remember last week that when water touched her, she um, went into like safety mode. So I wonder what's going to happen here. Roz felt safe up on the mountain top, so she spent the next few days and nights perched on the peak. But everything changed. One afternoon, when a low flying cloud crept up the mountain and Roz found herself surrounded by white, when the world faded black back into view, she noticed more clouds floating south past the island. Then she heard a deep rumble behind her. The robot turned her head around and saw that the sky was filled with a swirling wall of darkness. Light flickered here and there. More deep rumbles. What are the deep rumbles? Do you know what they are? A storm was approaching, and it wasn't just any storm, it was as fierce as the one that had sent the cargo ship to the ocean floor. The wind picked up, and the first drops of rain tapped against the robot. It was time to go. Roz unclamped her hands and began sliding down the peak. There's a picture of the storm that's happening. Hot sparks flew from where her body scraped against the leaning slab of stones. As soon as her feet hit soil, she was off and running. The rain fell harder, the wind blew faster, the lightning flashed brighter, the thunder cracked louder. So much rainwater was falling, the rushing rivers of the runoff started springing up everywhere. Ross splashed down the mountain, searching through the gloom for any kind of shelter, but she would have watched where she was going. Her heavy feet slipped and tripped, and she tumbled right into a mudslide. A robot was helpless. The river of mud whisked her downhill, slamming her into rocks and dragging her through brushes and sweeping her straight toward a cliff. Mud was pouring off the cliff like a waterfall. Roz frantically clawed at the ground, grasping for anything she could hold on to, but the flow only carried her faster towards the edge. And she was about to plunge over the side. She came to a hard, sudden stop. Mud surged around her, spraying into her face and pinning her against something solid. She blindly felt with her hands and recognized the thick roots of a trunk of a tree, of a pine tree. In an instant she was pulling herself into the branches, and the wind whipped across the mountainside, and Roz heard the familiar thunk of pine cones pelting her body. But she didn't mind them. She was just happy to be safe from the mud flow. The robot locked her arms and legs around the tree and waited for the storm to blow over. That is the end of chapter 12. Hope you guys enjoyed these chapters of The Wild Robot. Stay tuned for tomorrow's reading of chapters 8, 8, 9, 10, 11,